What does a man become when the world that worshipped him suddenly turns its back? When every smile hides a knife, every handshake conceals betrayal, and the woman he underestimated for years becomes the architect of his absolute destruction? Stay until the end, because this is not just a story about revenge. This is about the precise moment a man realizes that everything he built on lies can be unmantled by the truth. Be quiet. The winter masquerade at Thornhill Palace was always the crown jewel of the social season. But tonight, the gilded ballroom felt like a hunting ground. Duke Adrian Blackthorne stood near the marble columns, champagne glass balanced between his fingers, watching the swirl of silk gowns and tailored coats with the casual arrogance of a man who believed himself untouchable. He had worn that same confident smirk for 15 years of marriage, 15 years of carefully hidden affairs, 15 years of underestimating the woman who stood beside him now, her gloved hand resting lightly on his arm. Lady Evelyn Ashford Blackthorne was the picture of aristocratic grace. Her gown was midnight blue, simple compared to the peacock displays around them, and her dark hair was swept up to reveal the elegant curve of her neck. She smiled at passing nobles with the practiced warmth of someone who had spent a lifetime mastering the art of being invisible while standing in plain sight. Adrian barely glanced at her. He never did. Across the ballroom, Lord Hampton raised his glass in greeting, but his smile seemed strained. Adrian nodded back, noticing the slight hesitation before Hampton turned away to speak with another group. Strange. Hampton had been eager to discuss their upcoming railway investment just last week. What Adrian did not know was that Lord Hampton had received a letter that morning. It contained detailed records of how Adrian had deliberately sabotaged Hampton's brother's shipping company 5 years ago to eliminate competition. The letter was unsigned, but the evidence was meticulous, undeniable, and accompanied by copies of Adrian's own correspondence. Another man might have sensed the shift in the air. Another man might have noticed the way conversation seemed to quiet as he approached, the way old friends suddenly remembered pressing engagements elsewhere. But Adrian Blackthorne had spent so long at the center of his own universe that he could not imagine it collapsing. A servant appeared at his elbow, presenting a silver tray with a single envelope. The paper was expensive, cream-colored, sealed with black wax that bore no crest. Your presence is requested in the East Gallery at midnight. Come alone if you wish to protect what remains of your reputation. Adrian frowned, turning the envelope over. Evelyn leaned closer, her voice soft as silk. Bad news, darling? Just some tedious business matter. Nothing that concerns you. She smiled that gentle, understanding smile he had seen 10,000 times. Of course. I will be perfectly fine here. He kissed her hand briefly, a gesture so automatic it meant nothing, and moved toward the edge of the ballroom. The East Gallery was a long corridor lined with portraits of the royal family, dimly lit by scattered candelabras. At this hour, with the ball in full swing, it would be deserted. Perfect for a discreet conversation, whether about blackmail, scandal, or some desperate fool trying to extract money from him. Adrian walked with purpose, his footsteps echoing against marble. He had dealt with blackmailers before. They always wanted the same things: money, influence, a title they had no right to. He would listen to their demands, assess their leverage, and then crush them with the same cold efficiency he had used to eliminate every other obstacle in his path. What he did not consider was that this invitation was not a negotiation. It was the opening move in a game where he had already lost. Back in the ballroom, Evelyn accepted a glass of champagne from a passing servant and allowed herself the smallest of smiles. Not the practiced one she wore for society. Something sharper, colder, more real. She had spent 15 years perfecting that mask, learning every detail of her husband's lies, documenting every affair, every bribe, every cruel manipulation. Tonight, after years of silence, the evidence would speak for itself. Lord Ashford, her elderly uncle, approached with his wife on his arm. "Evelyn, my dear, you look radiant tonight." "Thank you, uncle. The masquerade is lovely as always. And where is that husband of yours? Attending to some business, I believe." "You know, Adrian, always working." Lord Ashford's expression tightened slightly. "Yes, I imagine he has much to attend to these days." The words carried weight Evelyn did not acknowledge. Her uncle was one of the few people who suspected the truth about her marriage, though he had never pressed her to act. She had told him months ago that she was handling things in her own way, and Lord Ashford, who had served as a military commander in his youth, understood the value of patience before a decisive strike. Across the ballroom, the Duchess of Harrington turned away when Evelyn tried to catch her eye. The slight was deliberate, public. Evelyn noted it without reaction, taking a sip of champagne. The Duchess had been Adrian's lover 3 years ago, a brief affair that ended when Adrian grew bored and moved on to younger prey. Evelyn had known about it within a week. She had known about all of them. What Adrian never understood was that Evelyn was not blind. She was careful. Every love letter he thought he had burned, she had copied. Every payment he made to silence inconvenient women, she had traced through bank records and household ledgers. Every lie he told, she had documented with the precision of a historian recording the fall of an empire. The clock struck 1:45. In the East Gallery, Adrian checked his pocket watch, irritation creeping into his expression. Whoever sent that invitation was late, a calculated insult or a sign of incompetence. Either way, he would make them pay for wasting his time. Then he heard footsteps. Not the confident stride of a man, but the lighter, measured pace of a woman. Adrian turned, expecting perhaps one of his former lovers come to plead for more money or attention. Instead, Lady Pemberton emerged from the shadows, her face pale and furious. "You bastard!" Adrian blinked, genuinely surprised. Lady Pemberton was the widow of one of his business associates, a woman he had barely spoken to in years. "I beg your pardon?" She stepped closer, and he saw she was holding papers. Her hands shook with barely contained rage. "My husband trusted you. He invested everything in your railroad scheme, and when it failed, you made sure he took all the blame while you walked away clean. He killed himself, Adrian. He put a pistol in his mouth because of you." Adrian's expression hardened. "That was a business arrangement that unfortunately did not work out. I had no control over his personal decisions. You knew the investments were fraudulent. You knew the projections were lies, and you let him sign his name to documents that destroyed him while you profited from the collapse." She threw the papers at his feet. Correspondence between Adrian and his lawyers, detailing exactly how they had structured the scheme to ensure he would be shielded from liability while his partners absorbed the losses. Adrian stared at the documents, his mind racing. These were supposed to be locked in his private study. How did she get them? Where did you find those? Lady Pemberton smiled bitterly. "Someone who clearly wants you to face what you have done. The same person who sent these to half the lords and ladies at this ball tonight." Adrian felt the floor tilt beneath him. Impossible. His study was secure, his correspondence guarded. No servant would dare steal from him, and his business partners knew better than to cross him. Unless, his thoughts flew to Evelyn, standing serenely in the ballroom, smiling her gentle smile. But no. Evelyn barely left the estate. She spent her days painting and reading, occupying herself with meaningless hobbies while he ran their empire. She did not have the cunning or the ruthlessness for something like this. "You are being manipulated, Lady Pemberton. Someone is using forged documents to create chaos. These are not forgeries. I have had them examined, your own handwriting, your own seal, and I am not the only one who received them tonight." She turned to leave, then paused. "I hope whoever is destroying you takes their time. You deserve to feel every moment of it." Adrian stood alone in the gallery, surrounded by the painted eyes of dead royalty, and for the first time in his life, he felt something close to fear. Back in the ballroom, the atmosphere had shifted. Small groups of nobles spoke in hushed tones, some casting glances toward the entrance where Adrian would eventually reappear. Evelyn moved through the crowd like a ghost, her presence so familiar that no one thought to question her. Lady Grantham, a sharp-eyed matron who controlled much of the social hierarchy, stopped Evelyn with a raised hand. "A word, if you please." "Of course." They stepped into a quieter alcove, away from the music and laughter. "I received some rather disturbing documents this afternoon. They concern your husband." Evelyn's expression remained perfectly neutral. "I see. Financial improprieties. Affairs, even allegations of more serious crimes. I assume you are aware of their contents. I have been aware of my husband's activities for many years, Lady Grantham." The older woman studied her carefully. "And yet you have remained silent. Silence can be strategic." Lady Grantham's eyes narrowed with understanding. "So this is your doing. I have simply ensured that the truth reached those who needed to see it. What they choose to do with that information is entirely their decision." A ghost of a smile touched Lady Grantham's lips. "You have been underestimated, Lady Blackthorn. Myself included, I confess. Most people underestimate patience. Indeed, well, you should know that by tomorrow morning, half of London will have heard about your husband's indiscretions. His business partners are already discussing withdrawing their investments, and several families are considering formal complaints to the Crown regarding his financial dealings." Evelyn inclined her head gracefully. "Then justice will take its course." Lady Grantham laughed softly. "You are far more dangerous than anyone realized. I look forward to seeing how this ends." She swept away, leaving Evelyn alone in the alcove. For the first time that evening, Evelyn allowed herself a full breath, the kind that filled her lungs completely and released years of held tension. She had been planning this for so long that she had almost forgotten what it felt like to simply exist without the weight of strategy pressing down on every moment. Adrian returned to the ballroom 20 minutes later, his face carefully composed, but his eyes scanning the crowd with new wariness. He found Evelyn near the refreshment tables, speaking with Lord Ashford. "Darling, we are leaving." Evelyn turned, her expression mildly surprised. "So early? The evening has barely begun. I have urgent matters that require attention." "Of course." She said her goodbyes to Lord Ashford and followed Adrian through the ballroom. As they passed, she noticed the whispers, the turned backs, the cold stares. Adrian noticed too. He walked faster, his jaw tight. Their carriage was waiting in the courtyard, and they rode in silence through the dark streets of London. Adrian stared out the window, his mind churning through possibilities. Who had access to his study? Who would benefit from his destruction? Business rivals, certainly, but none of them would have the detailed knowledge contained in those documents. It had to be someone inside his household, someone close enough to observe him for years without raising suspicion. When they arrived at Blackthorn Manor, Adrian went directly to his study, not bothering to help Evelyn from the carriage. She followed at a distance, pausing in the doorway to watch, as he tore through his desk drawers and file cabinets, searching for the breach. Everything appeared untouched. His correspondence was neatly filed, his ledgers in perfect order, but he knew now that appearances meant nothing. Someone had systematically copied every incriminating document he possessed and distributed them to his enemies. "Who has been in this room?" His voice was sharp, directed at the elderly butler who had appeared at the sound of commotion. "Only yourself and Lady Blackthorn, Your Grace, and the maids during their regular cleaning, but always under supervision." Adrian's gaze snapped to Evelyn, who stood calmly in the doorway, still wearing her evening gown. "You." She met his eyes without flinching. "Yes, you did this." "I have done many things, Adrian. You will need to be more specific." He crossed the room in 3 strides, stopping inches from her. The butler discreetly withdrew. "You stole my documents. You sent them to half of London. You are trying to destroy me." Evelyn smiled, and for the first time in 15 years of marriage, Adrian saw something in her expression that made his blood run cold. It was not anger or hatred. It was the calm satisfaction of someone watching a carefully constructed plan unfold exactly as designed. "I have not stolen anything, Adrian. I simply made copies. Every letter you wrote to your lovers, every bribe you paid, every fraudulent contract you signed. I have been collecting evidence for 15 years, waiting for the right moment to use it." His hand shot out, gripping her arm hard enough to bruise. "Why?" Her voice remained steady, almost gentle. "Because you destroyed people. Because you used your power to take what you wanted and discarded anyone who became inconvenient. Because you thought yourself so far above consequences that you never imagined someone might hold you accountable." He released her, stepping back as if she had burned him. "You have no idea what you have done. Those documents will ruin me." "Yes, that is the point. I will crush you for this. I will see you thrown into the streets with nothing." Evelyn adjusted her gloves, completely unruffled. "You are welcome to try. But you should know that copies of everything have been sent to the Crown's legal counsel, the Lord Chancellor, and several newspapers. By morning, your reputation will be demolished. Your business partners will abandon you, and any attempt to retaliate against me will only provide further evidence of your character." Adrian felt his world tilting. This could not be happening. Evelyn was timid, passive, content to live in his shadow. She did not have the strength or intelligence for this kind of coordinated assault. But as he looked at her now, standing in his study with that small, terrible smile, he realized he had never actually known his wife at all. He had seen what he wanted to see, a decorative accessory, a woman too weak to challenge him. He had been so convinced of his own superiority that he had failed to notice the predator he had married. "You are insane." "No, I am methodical. There is a difference." She turned to leave, then paused at the door. "Oh, and Adrian, one more thing. Do you remember a young servant girl named Margaret? She worked in your household about 7 years ago." Adrian's face went blank. He had employed dozens of servants over the years. He barely remembered their names. She was 16, pretty. "You seduced her, got her pregnant, and then paid her to disappear when she became inconvenient. She tried to get an abortion in a back alley clinic and died from infection 3 days later. Her mother has been trying to find justice ever since, but no one would listen to her because she was poor and you were powerful." Evelyn's voice remained calm, but something dark flickered in her eyes. "I found her mother 2 years ago. I have been helping her financially and promised her that one day the man responsible for her daughter's death would face consequences. That day is tomorrow. Her testimony, along with your correspondence arranging the payment, will be delivered to the authorities in the morning." Adrian felt bile rise in his throat. He barely remembered the girl. She had been a mistake, an indiscretion, nothing more. He had dealt with it the same way he dealt with all problems. Quickly, quietly, and with enough money to make it go away. "You cannot prove any of that." "I can. I have. And unlike you, I kept copies of everything." She left him standing in his study, surrounded by the evidence of his own corruption, and walked calmly up the stairs to her chambers. Inside, she locked the door, removed her gloves, and sat at her vanity. Her hands were steady. Her heartbeat was slow. She had imagined this moment so many times that the reality felt almost anticlimactic. But it was not over yet. This was only the beginning. Downstairs, Adrian poured himself a brandy and tried to think. He needed to contain this immediately. Call in favors, threaten anyone who dared speak against him, find a way to discredit Evelyn before her accusations gained traction. He had built his empire on ruthlessness and cunning. Surely he could outmaneuver his own wife. But even as he planned, doubt crept in. The documents she described were real. The testimonies were real. And Evelyn had clearly been preparing for this for years, which meant she had anticipated every move he might make in response. For the first time in his life, Duke Adrian Blackthorne felt the walls closing in. He did not sleep that night. He spent the hours before dawn writing letters, sending urgent messages to his lawyers and business associates, trying to build a defense against accusations he could not fully deny. But as the sun rose over London, bringing with it the morning papers, he realized the battle was already lost. The headlines were brutal. Duke Blackthorne, financial fraud and personal scandal. Rock the aristocracy victim's mother speaks out. My daughter died because of his lies. Lady Blackthorne's silent revenge. How one woman documented 15 years of corruption. Adrian stood in his study, holding the newspapers with shaking hands, and understood with perfect clarity that everything he had built was burning to ash around him. His title meant nothing now. His money would be seized to pay restitution. His name would become synonymous with scandal and cruelty. And through it all, Evelyn remained silent. She did not gloat. She did not rage. She simply waited, knowing that the mechanisms of justice and public opinion would do the work for her. By afternoon, creditors were demanding immediate repayment of loans. Business partners were formally dissolving their agreements. Former friends refused to answer his correspondence. The carefully constructed empire of Duke Adrian Blackthorne, built on lies and exploitation and the suffering of those weaker than himself, crumbled in a single day. And in her chambers, Evelyn Ashford Blackthorne sat by the window, watching the chaos unfold below, and felt something she had not experienced in 15 years. Peace. But this was only the first act of her revenge. The true devastation, the complete unraveling of everything Adrian had ever valued, was still to come. She had not spent 15 years planning this merely to see him embarrassed and financially ruined. She wanted him destroyed. Completely. Irreversibly. And she was only just beginning. The question that would haunt Adrian Blackthorne for the rest of his miserable life was simple and terrible. How had he never seen this coming? How had he underestimated her so completely? And most horrifying of all, what else had she planned that he still did not know about? The answer would arrive soon enough, and it would be worse than anything he could imagine. The morning after the scandal broke, Adrian Blackthorne discovered that reputation was not just a social asset. It was currency, leverage, the invisible architecture that held an entire life together. Without it, everything collapsed. He sat in his study as the grandfather clock struck 8, surrounded by opened letters that all said the same thing in different words. Investments withdrawn, partnerships dissolved, invitations rescinded. The language was polite, formal, but the message was clear. He was no longer welcome in the world he had ruled for 2 decades. The butler appeared in the doorway, his expression carefully neutral. "Lord Ashford is here to see you, Your Grace." Adrian's jaw tightened. Evelyn's uncle. "Of course. Come to gloat or deliver another blow. Show him in." Lord Ashford entered with the measured stride of a military man, though he had not served in uniform for 30 years. He was in his 60s, silver-haired, with the kind of weathered face that suggested he had seen enough of the world to be unimpressed by most of it. "Adrian, you look like hell. Thank you for the observation." Lord Ashford settled into a chair without being invited, studying Adrian with the detached interest of someone examining a specimen under glass. "I assume you know why I'm here? To celebrate your niece's victory?" The older man's expression did not change. "To tell you what happens next. The Crown's investigators will arrive tomorrow morning. They will seize your financial records, interview your staff, and begin building a case for fraud and embezzlement. You have perhaps 24 hours to prepare a defense, though I suspect there is no defense that will save you." Adrian leaned back in his chair, affecting a calm he did not feel. "Evelyn has turned you against me. Evelyn has done nothing but tell the truth, something you have avoided your entire life. Those documents are misleading, taken out of context." Lord Ashford laughed, a dry sound without humor. "I have read them, Adrian, every single page. There is no context that makes you look innocent. You defrauded business partners, bribed officials, seduced young women, and paid them to disappear. You are not a victim of circumstance. You're a predator who finally got caught." Adrian's hands gripped the armrests of his chair. "I built an empire from nothing. I created wealth, provided employment, contributed to this country's economy. My personal life is irrelevant. Your personal life includes a dead girl. Margaret Collins, 16 years old, died in agony because you impregnated her and then abandoned her to a butcher's clinic. Her mother will testify tomorrow, and when she does, every remaining shred of sympathy you might have had will evaporate." The name hit Adrian like a fist. He had buried that memory deep, convinced himself it was a minor incident that did not matter. But Lord Ashford was right. A dead child, a grieving mother, testimony delivered in front of the court and the press. There would be no recovery from that. "What does Evelyn want?" Lord Ashford stood, preparing to leave. "Evelyn wants you to understand what it feels like to be powerless, to watch everything you value get stripped away by forces you cannot control. She wants you to feel exactly what every person you destroyed has felt, and then she wants you to live with it." He paused at the door. "If you are looking for mercy, you married the wrong woman." Adrian sat alone after Lord Ashford left, feeling the walls close in. He had enemies before, rivals, competitors, but they had all operated within the same system, bound by the same rules. Evelyn was different. She was not trying to defeat him within the game. She was dismantling the entire board. Upstairs, Evelyn was in her private sitting room, reading correspondence. 3 letters from families Adrian had ruined. 2 from women he had discarded. 1 from a business partner who had lost everything in Adrian's railroad scheme. All of them expressing gratitude, relief, justice, finally served. She folded the letters carefully and placed them in a wooden box she kept locked in her wardrobe. These were not trophies, they were reminders. Each one represented a life Adrian had damaged without consequence, and each one strengthened her resolve to see this through to the end. Her maid, Catherine, entered with tea. "The staff is asking questions, my lady, about what happens next. Tell them their positions are secure. Whatever happens to this estate, they will be taken care of." Catherine hesitated. "And the Duke?" Evelyn looked up, her expression unreadable. "The Duke will have to fend for himself." By mid-afternoon, the first wave of creditors arrived. Adrian met them in the drawing room, attempting to maintain the appearance of control even as they presented bills, loan documents, investment agreements all now being called in immediately. A banker named Whitmore, whom Adrian had considered a friend, laid out a stack of papers on the mahogany table. These are outstanding loans totaling £73,000. Under normal circumstances, we would negotiate a payment plan, but given the revelations about your financial practices, the bank has decided to demand immediate repayment. Adrian's voice was cold. That is impossible, and you know it. Then we will begin seizure proceedings. This estate, your properties in the country, your investments, all of it will be liquidated to satisfy the debt. You would destroy me over allegations? Whitmore's expression hardened. These are not allegations, Adrian. I have seen the evidence. You used fraudulent projections to secure loans you knew you could not repay. You diverted funds meant for legitimate investments into personal accounts. The only reason you were not caught sooner is because you were skilled at covering your tracks. But your wife was more skilled at uncovering them. Adrian felt rage building in his chest, the kind that came from being cornered with no way out. Evelyn again. Always Evelyn. The woman he had ignored, dismissed, underestimated for 15 years was now the architect of his complete destruction. I will fight this. You will lose. The evidence is overwhelming. Save yourself the embarrassment and accept what is coming. After Whitmore left, Adrian poured himself a drink. Then another. The alcohol burned but did not dull the growing panic. He had always believed that power and money could solve any problem, but Evelyn had stripped both away with surgical precision, leaving him exposed and vulnerable. There was a knock at the door. His solicitor, Mr. Grayson, entered looking grim. I have reviewed the documents circulating through London. Adrian, this is catastrophic. Every allegation is supported by physical evidence, letters in your handwriting, bank statements with your signature, witness testimonies that corroborate the timeline. I cannot build a defense when you are clearly guilty of everything being alleged. Then find a way to discredit the evidence. It cannot be discredited. Your wife kept meticulous records. More than that, she had them independently verified by multiple sources before releasing them. Even if we could cast doubt on one or two documents, the sheer volume makes that strategy impossible. Adrian slammed his glass down on the desk. So what do you suggest? That I surrender? I suggest you prepare for the possibility of criminal charges. Fraud, embezzlement, possibly manslaughter in the case of Margaret Collins. You could be looking at prison time. The word hung in the air like a death sentence. Prison. The idea was so absurd, so impossible, that Adrian could not process it. Men of his class did not go to prison. They paid fines, made settlements, at worst endured temporary exile. But prison? That will not happen. Grayson's expression suggested otherwise. It might. The Crown is under pressure to make an example of you. Too many people have been demanding accountability for the aristocracy's abuses. You have become the perfect target. After Grayson left, Adrian stood at the window, looking out at the gardens. The estate was immaculate as always, the hedges perfectly trimmed, the fountain gleaming in the afternoon sun. He had built all of this, created it from nothing through intelligence, ambition, ruthlessness, and now it was slipping through his fingers like water. He thought about Evelyn, wondered where she was at this moment. Probably in her sitting room, calmly reading or painting as if the world were not burning around them. That was what disturbed him most. Not her anger or hatred, but her absolute composure. She had orchestrated his destruction with the same serene efficiency she brought to arranging flowers or planning dinner parties. That evening, a dinner party he could not cancel was scheduled at the estate, a gathering of old friends and allies, arranged weeks ago when his reputation was still intact. Adrian considered canceling, but that would be an admission of defeat. Better to face them, prove he was still in control. The guests arrived promptly at 7. Adrian greeted them in the foyer with Evelyn at his side, both playing their roles with practiced ease. But the atmosphere was wrong from the start. Conversations were strained, laughter forced. People who used to seek Adrian's attention now avoided eye contact. Lord Pemberton, whose wife had confronted Adrian at the masquerade, arrived last. He did not shake Adrian's hand. I'm only here because canceling would have been even more awkward. But make no mistake, Blackthorn. After tonight, you will never be welcome in my home again. Adrian felt the insult like a slap, but kept his expression neutral. That is your prerogative. The dinner was excruciating. Every course felt like an endurance test. The guests spoke in careful platitudes, avoiding any topic that might reference the scandal while also making it clear through their coldness that they had chosen sides. Lady Grantham, seated near Evelyn, broke the tension with characteristic bluntness. Lady Blackthorne, I must commend you on your patience. 15 years is a long time to wait for justice. Adrian's knife scraped against his plate. The sound cut through the room. Evelyn smiled graciously. Some things are worth waiting for. Still, one wonders what kind of marriage requires such deception. On both sides. The implication was clear. Evelyn had lied too, concealed her true nature, manipulated everyone around her. But Evelyn did not flinch. I prefer to think of it as survival. When you are married to a man who views you as property rather than a partner, you learn to protect yourself. Adrian set down his silverware carefully. We are not having this conversation here. Why not? Everyone at this table knows the truth now. There is no point in maintaining the pretense. Lord Pemberton leaned forward. I would like to hear it. How does a man justify what you have done, Adrian? The affairs, the fraud, the dead girl? The room went silent. Adrian's face darkened with rage. That is enough. No, I do not think it is. You have hidden behind your title and your money for too long. Tonight, you answer for it. Adrian stood abruptly, his chair scraping against the floor. This dinner is over. I want all of you out of my house. Evelyn remained seated, her voice calm. It is not your house anymore, Adrian. The bank will seize it by the end of the week, and these people are my guests, not yours. If anyone is leaving, it is you. The challenge hung in the air. Adrian looked around the table and saw only hostile faces. No allies, no friends. Just people who had tolerated him for his power and now felt free to turn on him. He walked out without another word, leaving Evelyn to host the remainder of the dinner alone. She did so with grace, speaking quietly with the guests about her plans for the estate and the charitable work she intended to pursue. By the time they left, she had secured commitments of support from several influential families. Adrian spent the night in his study, drinking and staring at the documents spread across his desk. He tried to find a way out, some strategy or leverage he had overlooked, but every path led to the same conclusion. He was finished. The next morning, the Crown's investigators arrived as Lord Ashford had predicted. They were efficient and thorough, seizing boxes of financial records and interviewing staff members one by one. Adrian watched from the window as they carried his entire life out of the house in crates. Evelyn met with them in the drawing room, providing additional documentation she had kept separate from Adrian's files. She answered their questions with clarity and precision, never hesitating, never stumbling. It was a performance years in the making, and she delivered it flawlessly. When they finally left, Adrian confronted her in the hallway. You have destroyed me. Are you satisfied? Not yet. What more could you possibly want? I want you to lose everything. Your title, your fortune, your freedom. I want you to live long enough to see your name become synonymous with shame. And I want you to understand that it was your own choices that brought you here. Not me. Not bad luck. You. Adrian felt something break inside him, some last reserve of defiance or pride. He had always believed he was smarter than everyone else, more capable, destined for greatness. But Evelyn had proven that intelligence without empathy was just another form of blindness. Why did you marry me if you hated me so much? Evelyn's expression softened slightly, not with affection, but with something closer to pity. I did not hate you at first. I thought you could change. I believed that love and patience might reveal a better man underneath the arrogance. But after the first affair, the first lie, the first time you looked through me as if I did not exist, I realized you were incapable of seeing anyone but yourself. So I stopped trying to change you and started planning your destruction instead. She walked past him toward the stairs, then paused. Margaret Collins was the final straw. When I learned what you did to that girl, how you paid to make her disappear and never gave her another thought, I knew you were beyond redemption. She was 16, Adrian, a child, and you killed her as surely as if you had pulled the trigger yourself. The name again. That damned girl. Adrian had not thought about her in years, had buried the memory so deep he almost convinced himself it never happened. But Evelyn had not forgotten. She had tracked down the mother, collected the evidence, turned a moment of careless cruelty into the weapon that would destroy him. That night, Adrian received word that the Crown had filed formal charges. Fraud, embezzlement, contributing to the death of Margaret Collins through criminal negligence. The trial would begin within the month. His lawyers advised him to flee the country, but Evelyn had anticipated that too. His assets were frozen, his passport confiscated. He was trapped. The following weeks became a blur of humiliation. His club membership was revoked. Former friends crossed the street to avoid him. Newspapers published cartoons depicting him as a demon or monster. The public, hungry for a villain they could hate without complication, embraced the narrative with enthusiasm. Evelyn, meanwhile, was lauded as a hero. The woman who endured years of abuse and betrayal in silence, gathering evidence, waiting for the perfect moment to strike. Editorials praised her patience and cunning. Women's groups held her up as an example of strength in the face of oppression. Adrian watched it all from the confines of the estate, which now felt more like a prison than a home. His movements were restricted pending trial. He could not leave London, could not access his fortune, could not even hire the best lawyers because no one wanted to be associated with his defense. One afternoon, he found Evelyn in the garden, tending to roses she had planted years ago. He approached slowly, unsure what he even wanted to say. How long did it take to plan all of this? She did not look up from her work. Years. I started collecting evidence almost immediately after our wedding. Every letter you wrote to your mistresses, I copied. Every financial irregularity, I documented. I learned your routines, your passwords, your hiding places. You thought I was spending my days painting and reading. I was building a case. Adrian sat on a nearby bench, suddenly exhausted. I underestimated you. Everyone did. That was my advantage. Do you feel victorious? Evelyn finally looked at him, and he saw no triumph in her eyes. Only a vast, cold emptiness. I feel tired. Revenge is not as satisfying as people imagine. It does not erase what was done. It does not bring back Margaret Collins or repair the families you destroyed. It is simply the only form of justice available when the law protects men like you instead of punishing them. Adrian had no response. She was right. He had used his power and position to escape consequences for years, and now that he was finally facing them, he had no defense except to claim that this was how the world worked. The strong took what they wanted, the weak suffered. But Evelyn had proven there was a third option. The patient could outlast the strong. The overlooked could become the hunter. And a woman dismissed as weak could orchestrate the fall of an empire. The trial date was set. Adrian's lawyers managed to delay it slightly, but they held out no hope for acquittal. The evidence was overwhelming, the public sentiment hostile. The best they could hope for was a reduced sentence, perhaps exile instead of prison. But even that thin hope evaporated when Evelyn delivered her final blow. She had been holding back one piece of evidence. A letter Adrian had written to a business associate discussing how to structure the railroad investments to ensure maximum profit while shielding themselves from liability. In the letter, Adrian explicitly acknowledged that the project was doomed to fail and that their partners would absorb the losses. It was the smoking gun, undeniable proof of intent to defraud. When it was entered into evidence, even Adrian's most aggressive lawyers admitted there was no defense. The night before the trial began, Adrian stood in his study one last time, looking at the empty shelves where his documents used to be. Everything had been seized, examined, catalogued as evidence. His entire life reduced to exhibits in a criminal case. He thought about running. There were still ways to disappear, people who could smuggle him out of the country for the right price. But where would he go? What would he do? He was a duke without a title, a businessman without capital, a man whose name was now poison. And Evelyn would know. She would know he ran like a coward, and that knowledge would somehow be worse than whatever punishment awaited him in court. So he stayed. The trial lasted 3 weeks. Every day brought new revelations, new witnesses, new evidence of his crimes. Margaret Collins' mother testified, describing in heartbreaking detail how her daughter had died. Former business partners recounted how Adrian had destroyed them. Women he had seduced and discarded spoke about the payments, the threats, the casual cruelty. Through it all, Adrian sat in the defendant's box, watching his entire life dissected for public consumption. And Evelyn sat in the gallery every single day, her face calm, her presence a constant reminder of who had orchestrated this. On the final day, the prosecutor delivered a closing argument that would be reprinted in newspapers across the country. Adrian Blackthorne is not a victim of circumstance or a casualty of changing times. He is a man who used every advantage of birth, wealth, and position to exploit those weaker than himself. He seduced young women and discarded them. He defrauded business partners and destroyed families. He contributed directly to the death of a 16-year-old girl and felt no remorse. He represents everything wrong with a system that protects the powerful at the expense of the vulnerable. And today, that system must hold him accountable. The jury deliberated for less than 4 hours. Guilty on all counts. The judge sentenced Adrian to 12 years in prison, followed by permanent exile from England. His title was stripped. His fortune was seized and distributed among his victims. Blackthorn Manor was transferred to Evelyn's control. As the guards led him away in chains, Adrian looked back one final time. Evelyn was standing near the courtroom door, watching him leave. Their eyes met, and he saw in her expression something he had never noticed before. Not hatred, not triumph. Relief. She had carried the weight of his crimes for 15 years, documenting every betrayal, every cruelty, every casual act of destruction. And now, finally, she could set that burden down. Adrian disappeared into the prison system, just another inmate in a gray uniform. The world moved on quickly. New scandals replaced his. New villains captured the public's attention. Within months, most people had forgotten his name, but Evelyn never forgot. She transformed Blackthorn Manor into a refuge for women escaping abusive marriages, providing shelter, legal assistance, and job training. She used Adrian's seized fortune to create a foundation in Margaret Collins' name, supporting young women from poor families. And every time someone asked her about her husband, she gave the same answer. I was married to a man who believed himself above consequence. I proved him wrong. That is all there is to say. The society that once celebrated Adrian Blackthorn now celebrated his wife, and the man who had ruled through fear and manipulation learned too late that there were forces in the world more powerful than wealth or title: patience, memory, and the absolute determination of a woman who refused to be broken. Adrian Blackthorn spent his first night in Millbank Prison staring at a ceiling stained with water damage and decades of human misery. The cell was 8 feet by 6, barely large enough for a narrow cot and a bucket that served purposes he refused to think about. The walls were damp stone. The air smelled of rot and unwashed bodies. This was where empires came to die. He did not sleep. Every sound echoed through the corridors: distant screaming, coughing, the clang of metal doors. The guards walked past every few hours, their boots heavy on stone, and Adrian felt the weight of anonymity settle over him like a burial shroud. Here, he was not a duke. He was prisoner 4782. A number. Nothing more. The other inmates knew who he was. Word traveled fast in places like this. A fallen aristocrat made excellent entertainment for men who had nothing left to lose. They jeered when he was escorted to the common area for meals. They spat at his feet. One man, a wiry fellow with scars across his knuckles, cornered him near the water pump. "You are the one who killed that girl." Margaret Collins. Adrian kept his expression neutral. "I was convicted of fraud and negligence, not murder." The man leaned closer, his breath sour. "My daughter was 15 when some rich bastard got her pregnant and threw her away. She survived, but barely. So you will forgive me if I do not see much difference." He shoved Adrian hard enough to send him stumbling. The guards did not intervene. They watched with the detached interest of men who had seen this scene play out 1,000 times before. Adrian learned quickly that prison had its own economy, its own hierarchy. He had no allies here, no one he could bribe or manipulate. The skills that made him powerful in the outside world meant nothing when surrounded by men who had already lost everything. But even in his lowest moment, confined to a cell that smelled of despair, Adrian Blackthorn did not believe he was finished. He still had one asset that Evelyn could not take away: his mind. And minds, properly applied, could turn any situation to advantage. 3 weeks into his sentence, Adrian received his first visitor. Not Evelyn, who had made it clear she never wanted to see him again. Not any of his former friends, who had abandoned him the moment his conviction was announced. It was his younger brother, Thomas Blackthorn, whom Adrian had not spoken to in nearly 5 years. Thomas was everything Adrian was not. Soft-spoken, bookish, content with a modest estate in the countryside and a quiet life away from London's intrigues. Adrian had always considered him weak, beneath notice. But Thomas was also the only family member who had not publicly denounced him after the trial. They met in a small room reserved for visits, separated by a wooden table scarred with carved initials and obscenities. Thomas looked uncomfortable, his hands folded in his lap, his eyes avoiding direct contact. "You look terrible." Adrian's laugh was bitter. "Prison has that effect. I am not here to gloat. Despite everything, you are still my brother. How noble of you." Thomas leaned forward slightly, lowering his voice. "There is talk in London about Evelyn." Adrian felt something shift in his chest. What kind of talk? "People are calling her a hero, a martyr, the woman who suffered in silence and brought down a tyrant. She has the support of half the aristocracy now, including some very powerful families." Adrian's jaw tightened. "Of course she does. She planned this perfectly. That is what disturbs me." Thomas hesitated, choosing his words carefully. "No one plans that well unless they have help. Evelyn is intelligent, certainly, but what she accomplished required resources, connections, access to information she should not have had. I have been asking questions, quietly, and there are inconsistencies." "What kind of inconsistencies?" Thomas pulled a folded piece of paper from his coat and slid it across the table. It was a bank statement, dated 3 years earlier, showing a large deposit into an account under Evelyn's maiden name. Ashford. "Where did this money come from?" Adrian asked. "That is what I wanted to know, so I traced it. The funds originated from a trust controlled by Lord Ashford, her uncle." Adrian stared at the paper, his mind racing. Lord Ashford had been involved in Evelyn's plan from the beginning. That much was obvious during the trial. But the timing of this deposit suggested something deeper. 3 years ago, Evelyn had still been playing the role of dutiful wife. She had shown no signs of rebellion, no indication that she was plotting his destruction. Yet she was already receiving substantial financial support from her uncle. Thomas continued, his voice barely above a whisper. "There is more. Lord Ashford served in military intelligence before he retired. He has connections to people who specialize in gathering information, the kind of people who can access private correspondence, financial records, things that should be secure." Adrian felt the pieces shifting in his mind, forming a picture he had not considered before. Evelyn had not done this alone. She had backing, resources, expertise that went far beyond what a sheltered noblewoman should possess, which meant her entire persona, the quiet, elegant wife who spent her days painting and reading, was not just a mask she wore for Adrian. It was a constructed identity, designed and maintained by people with experience in deception. Who else knows about this? No one. I have been very careful. But Adrian, if I am right, Evelyn is not just a wronged wife seeking justice. She is part of something larger, and you are not her target. You are her assignment. The words hung in the air like smoke. Adrian had spent months believing he had been brought down by his own arrogance, his own mistakes. But if Thomas was right, if Evelyn had been planted in his life with the specific purpose of destroying him, then everything he thought he understood was wrong. Why would they target me? Thomas shook his head. I do not know, but I intend to find out. In the meantime, you need to survive in here long enough for me to gather more evidence. After Thomas left, Adrian sat in his cell, staring at the wall, feeling the foundations of his understanding crumble. He had underestimated Evelyn. That much was clear, but he had also been deceived on a level he had not imagined possible. If she was an agent, trained and supported by people with resources and expertise, then her patience, her meticulous documentation, her perfect execution of his downfall were not just the actions of a clever woman, they were the work of a professional. And professionals did not act without a reason. Over the following weeks, Adrian became obsessed with uncovering the truth. He wrote letters to Thomas, outlining questions, suggesting avenues of investigation. His brother responded with fragments of information, pieces of a puzzle that refused to come into focus. Lord Ashford had connections to several government officials. Some of them had been present at the trial, observing from the gallery. Evelyn had traveled to London twice in the year before the scandal broke, supposedly to visit relatives, but there were gaps in her itinerary that Thomas could not account for. And most damning of all, there were records of correspondence between Evelyn and a man named Richard Caldwell, a retired intelligence officer who now worked as a private consultant for wealthy clients seeking information. Adrian had never heard the name before, But Thomas assured him that Caldwell was well known in certain circles, a man who could find anything, arrange anything, destroy anyone, for the right price. The question was, who had paid him? Adrian spent his days in the prison library, a cramped room filled with outdated books and newspapers that were weeks old by the time they arrived. He read obsessively, searching for clues, patterns, anything that might explain why he had been targeted. And slowly, a theory began to form. 5 years before his trial, Adrian had orchestrated the hostile takeover of a shipping company owned by the Hargrove family. It had been a standard business maneuver, ruthless but legal. The Hargroves lost everything, their fortune dissolved, their reputation destroyed. The patriarch of the family, Lord Edmund Hargrove, had died shortly after, some said from the stress. Adrian had not given it much thought. Business was war. There were winners and losers. But what if the Hargroves had not accepted their loss? What if they had spent the last 5 years planning revenge, using their remaining resources to hire people like Caldwell, to insert someone like Evelyn into Adrian's life, to systematically document every crime and indiscretion until they had enough to destroy him? It made sense. The precision of the attack, the careful timing, the involvement of intelligence operatives. This was not the work of a wronged wife. This was the work of enemies who had been patient enough to play a long game. Adrian wrote to Thomas, outlining his theory. His brother responded with caution. It is possible, but I need more evidence. If you are right and Evelyn was placed in your life deliberately, then your marriage was never real. Everything she did, every moment you spent together, was performance. Can you accept that? Adrian stared at the letter for a long time. Could he accept it? The idea that he had been manipulated from the very beginning, that his choice of wife had not been his choice at all, but the result of careful engineering by people who wanted to see him destroyed? It should have been devastating. A final humiliation. But instead he felt something else. Clarity. If Evelyn had been part of a conspiracy, then she was not invincible. She was following orders, working within a structure, dependent on the people who had hired her, which meant she had vulnerabilities, weaknesses. And if Adrian could find them, he might still have a chance to turn the situation to his advantage. He began to study everything he could find about intelligence operations, espionage, the techniques used to infiltrate and destroy targets. The prison library had surprisingly good resources on the subject, histories of wars and political intrigues, accounts of spies and double agents. Adrian read them all, absorbing strategies, looking for patterns. One book in particular caught his attention, a memoir by a former intelligence officer who described how long-term infiltration operations worked. The key, the author explained, was creating genuine emotional attachment. An agent who remained emotionally detached was always at risk of being discovered. But an agent who allowed themselves to develop real feelings, even love, for their target became much more convincing. The deception went deeper because part of it was not deception at all, which meant that somewhere beneath Evelyn's carefully constructed persona, there might be genuine emotion, something he could exploit. Adrian wrote to Thomas again, this time with a new request. I need you to find out if Evelyn has shown any signs of regret or hesitation, any indication that she did not enjoy what she did to me. If she is still following orders, she will have moved on to her next assignment. But if she has remained focused on me, on monitoring the aftermath of my trial, then there is still emotional investment, and that is a weakness. Thomas responded 3 weeks later. Evelyn has not moved on. She visits the courthouse records regularly, reviewing the trial transcripts. She has been seen near the prison on multiple occasions, though she never enters. And according to my sources, she has been writing letters to someone, though I have not been able to determine who. Adrian felt the pieces fall into place. Evelyn was still engaged, still watching him, still involved in his destruction, which meant the professional detachment required for a successful long-term operation had fractured. She had become personally invested, perhaps even conflicted, and conflict was something he could use. Adrian began writing letters to Evelyn, carefully crafted messages designed to destabilize her certainty. He did not beg for forgiveness or plead for mercy. Instead, he wrote about the inconsistencies in her story, the questions he had uncovered, the suggestion that she had been used by people who did not care about justice, but only about settling old scores. He knew the letters would never reach her directly. The prison censors read everything, but he also knew that Thomas could arrange for copies to be delivered through other channels. And if Evelyn read them, if she saw that Adrian had figured out the truth, it would force her to respond. 3 months into his sentence, Evelyn came to visit. She sat across from him in the visiting room wearing a simple gray dress, her hair pulled back in a practical style. She looked tired, Adrian thought. The triumphant glow from the trial had faded, replaced by something harder, colder. "You have been writing letters, and you have been reading them." Evelyn folded her hands on the table. "What you have discovered changes nothing. You are still guilty of the crimes you were convicted of, still responsible for Margaret Collins' death, still a man who used his power to hurt people." Adrian leaned forward, his voice low and controlled. "I am not disputing my guilt. I am questioning yours. Tell me, Evelyn, when did you decide to marry me? Was it before or after Lord Ashford and Richard Caldwell convinced you it was necessary?" Her expression did not change, but Adrian saw the flicker of recognition in her eyes. She had not expected him to know those names. "You think you are clever, uncovering a conspiracy, but all you have found are connections between people who care about justice. My uncle supported me because I was trapped in a marriage with a monster. Caldwell helped me gather evidence because that is what he does. There is no grand plot, just people working together to stop you." Adrian smiled, the expression cold and joyless. "If that were true, you would not have come here. You would have ignored my letters and moved on with your life. But you did not. You came because you need to know what I have figured out, because you are afraid that I might have found something that threatens the people who used you. That is absurd, is it? Tell me, Evelyn, do you even know why the Hargroves wanted me destroyed? Did Caldwell explain the real reason, or did he just tell you I was a monster who deserved to fall?" The name Hargrove hit her like a physical blow. Adrian saw it in the way her shoulders tensed, the slight widening of her eyes. She had not known. Or if she had not understood the significance. Edmund Hargrove died 5 years ago. His family blamed me for the loss of their fortune. They wanted revenge, and they had the resources to make it happen. So they hired Caldwell. And Caldwell hired you, or recruited you. However it worked. You were inserted into my life with a specific purpose, to document my crimes, to gather evidence, to destroy me from the inside. Everything you did, every smile, every patient conversation, every year of quiet suffering was part of an operation. And you were too blinded by your own sense of righteousness to realize you were being used. Evelyn stood abruptly, her face pale. "You are lying." "Am I?" "Ask Caldwell. Ask your uncle. Ask them why they never told you about the Hargroves. Ask them what they gained from my destruction beyond simple justice." She turned to leave, then stopped at the door. "Even if what you are saying is true, it does not change what you did. You are still guilty. And so are you, Evelyn. You just have not admitted it yet." After she left, Adrian sat in the visiting room for a long time, staring at the empty chair across from him. He had planted the seed. Now he had to wait and see if it would grow. Thomas visited again 2 weeks later, bringing news that confirmed Adrian's suspicions. Evelyn had gone to Lord Ashford's estate and confronted him. There had been a heated argument, loud enough that servants overheard fragments of it, words like manipulation and used and lied to. Lord Ashford had tried to calm her, to explain that the ends justified the means, but Evelyn had left in tears. "She knows," Thomas said quietly, "and she is devastated." Adrian felt a grim satisfaction. Devastation was good. Devastation led to anger, and anger led to mistakes. But Thomas looked troubled. "Adrian, you need to understand something. Even if Evelyn was manipulated, even if she was part of a larger conspiracy, that does not absolve you of your crimes. You still did everything they accused you of. You still destroyed lives, still caused Margaret Collins' death. Uncovering this conspiracy might give you leverage, but it does not make you innocent. I'm not looking for innocence. I'm looking for survival. And to survive, I need Evelyn to turn on the people who used her. If she does, if she provides evidence of their involvement, it creates reasonable doubt about the trial's integrity. It opens the door for appeals, retrials, reduced sentences. And then what? You get out of prison and go back to being the man you were?" Adrian met his brother's eyes, and for the first time in months, he felt something close to honesty rising in his chest. "No, I do not think that is possible anymore, but I need to get out of here first. Everything else comes after." The final piece of the plan came together 3 weeks later. Evelyn sent a letter to Adrian, delivered through official channels so the censors would see it. The letter was brief, formal, but the subtext was clear. I have discovered certain irregularities in the evidence presented at your trial. I believe there may have been outside influence that compromised the proceedings. I am meeting with the Crown's prosecutor next week to discuss this matter. You will be informed of any developments. Adrian read the letter twice, feeling the weight of victory settle over him. Evelyn had turned. She was going to expose the conspiracy, throw her uncle and Caldwell under the carriage in exchange for a clear conscience. And in doing so, she would give Adrian exactly what he needed. Not freedom, not immediately, but leverage. The possibility of a future beyond these walls. But as he sat in his cell that night, Adrian felt something unexpected. Not triumph, not satisfaction, just a vast, aching emptiness. He had won, or at least he had found a way to turn his defeat into a stalemate. But the cost had been everything. This response didn't load. Try again. The meeting between Evelyn and the Crown's prosecutor was scheduled for a Tuesday morning in late spring. Adrian learned this through Thomas, who had been monitoring Evelyn's movements with increasing frequency. The location was the prosecutor's private chambers in Westminster, a discreet setting designed to avoid drawing public attention. If Evelyn was going to expose the conspiracy, if she was going to confirm that her evidence had been tainted by outside manipulation, this was where it would happen. Adrian spent the night before unable to sleep, his mind cycling through possibilities. If Evelyn followed through, if she admitted that Lord Ashford and Richard Caldwell had orchestrated her marriage and guided her collection of evidence, then the entire foundation of his conviction would crack. Not enough to free him immediately, but enough to demand a retrial. And in a retrial, with public opinion shifted by revelations of manipulation and conspiracy, he might actually survive. But survival required Evelyn to betray the people who had supported her, required her to admit that her triumph, her moment of justice, had been engineered by others for their own purposes. That was not an easy thing for anyone to do, especially someone who had built her entire identity around being the wronged wife who fought back. Thomas arrived at the prison early Wednesday morning, his face grim. Adrian was escorted to the visiting room, his wrists still bearing the marks from the shackles they used during transport. His brother sat across from him, silent for a long moment. She did not do it. Adrian felt the words like a punch to the gut. What? Evelyn met with the prosecutor, but she did not expose the conspiracy. She confirmed her testimony from the trial, said there were no irregularities, said everything she provided was accurate and obtained through her own efforts. That is impossible. She knows the truth. I saw it in her face when I mentioned the Hargroves. She was devastated. Thomas leaned forward, lowering his voice. She was devastated. But between our conversation and yesterday's meeting, something changed. Someone got to her. Adrian's hands clenched into fists on the table. Ashford, probably. Or Caldwell, maybe both. They convinced her that exposing the conspiracy would discredit everything she accomplished, that it would make Margaret Collins' death meaningless, would let you off the hook, would betray all the victims who trusted her. They played on her guilt and her righteousness until she chose loyalty over truth. Adrian felt something dark and cold spreading through his chest. The realization that he had been so close, that victory had been within reach, and then vanished because Evelyn had been turned back to the very people who had used her. It was almost poetic. The woman he had underestimated had been underestimated by him yet again. Not because she lacked intelligence or courage, but because she had something he would never understand. A capacity to subordinate her own interests to what she believed was right, even when that belief had been carefully manufactured by people manipulating her. There has to be a way to force her hand. Thomas shook his head. I have been trying, but Evelyn has closed ranks. She is no longer answering my letters. Lord Ashford's estate is locked down, and Caldwell has disappeared entirely. Whoever is running this operation, they have tightened security after your letters spooked them. Adrian stared at the scarred wood of the table, feeling the walls close in. He had gambled everything on the possibility that Evelyn's conscience would crack under the weight of truth. But conscience was a flexible thing. It could be reshaped, redirected, weaponized. The people controlling Evelyn understood that better than he did. Then I need to find another angle. There is no other angle, Adrian. You are in prison. Your resources are gone. Your allies have abandoned you. And the one person who might have helped you just chose to keep you buried. You need to accept that this is over. Adrian looked at his brother, seeing the exhaustion in his face, the defeat. Thomas had spent months trying to uncover the truth. And for what? A conspiracy they could not prove, a victim who refused to be saved, a brother who was running out of time. But Adrian Blackthorne had spent his entire life refusing to accept defeat. It was the core of his identity, the engine that drove every decision. Even now, locked in a cage built by his enemies, he could not surrender to the idea that someone else controlled his fate. "Get me a meeting with Caldwell." Thomas blinked. "What? You said he disappeared. That means he is still in England, still close enough to monitor the situation. Find him. Tell him I want to negotiate." "Negotiate what?" "You have nothing to offer." Adrian smiled, thin and cold. "I have information. About the Hargroves. About why they really wanted me destroyed. If Caldwell is the professional you claim, he will want to know what I know. And once he is in front of me, I can work with that." Thomas looked skeptical but nodded slowly. "I will try, but do not expect miracles." After his brother left, Adrian returned to his cell and began to plan. Caldwell was the key. Evelyn was too emotionally compromised, too dependent on her constructed sense of justice. Lord Ashford was a true believer, convinced that destroying Adrian served a greater good. But Caldwell was a mercenary, a man who worked for money and leverage, who understood the transactional nature of power. If Adrian could offer him something valuable, something that outweighed his contract with the Hargroves, there might be room for negotiation. The question was, what did Adrian actually know about the Hargroves that Caldwell would care about? He spent days combing through his memories, reconstructing the hostile takeover of their shipping company. It had been 5 years ago, a complex operation involving multiple shell companies and careful manipulation of stock prices. Adrian had bankrupted them efficiently, taking their assets and distributing them among his own holdings. Edmund Hargrove had died shortly after, officially from a heart attack, but rumored to be suicide. But there had been something else. A detail Adrian had almost forgotten. During the takeover, he had discovered that the Hargroves were involved in smuggling operations. Nothing massive, just side business moving luxury goods without paying import duties. Adrian had documented the evidence but never used it, deciding that destroying their finances was sufficient. The information had been filed away, locked in a safe deposit box in a bank that still held some of Adrian's personal effects. If that evidence still existed, if Thomas could retrieve it, then Adrian would have leverage. Not against the Hargroves directly, since their reputation was already destroyed, but against anyone who had done business with them. And if Caldwell had clients who were connected to those operations, who would be implicated if the evidence became public, then suddenly Adrian had something to trade. It was a long shot, but long shots were all he had left. Thomas managed to arrange the meeting 3 weeks later. Caldwell arrived at the prison on a gray afternoon, dressed in an expensive suit that looked out of place in the dingy visiting room. He was in his 50s, lean and sharp-eyed, with the bearing of someone who had spent years in dangerous places and learned to trust no one. He sat across from Adrian without pleasantries, studying him the way a naturalist might study a pinned insect. "You wanted to talk." "Talk." Adrian leaned back in his chair, affecting a calm he did not feel. "I know why the Hargroves hired you. Edmund's children want revenge for their father's death. They blame me for destroying the family. Standard grievance, nothing surprising, but what you might not know is that the Hargroves were not innocent victims. They were criminals, smugglers, and I have evidence that proves it." Caldwell's expression did not change. "Even if that were true, it is irrelevant. The Hargroves paid me to destroy you, and I did. Their moral character was never part of the contract, but their business partner's moral character might be." Adrian pulled a folded piece of paper from his pocket, a letter Thomas had smuggled in during the last visit. "This is a list of names. People who bought smuggled goods through Hargrove shipping channels. Some of them are still active in London society. Some of them are your current clients." He slid the paper across the table. Caldwell picked it up, scanned it quickly, and for the first time, Adrian saw a flicker of interest in those cold eyes. "Where is the evidence?" "In a safe deposit box. Ledgers, correspondence, shipping manifests. Everything needed to prove that these people were involved in illegal trade. If that information becomes public, several of your current clients will face criminal charges, which means they will stop being clients, which means you lose money." Caldwell set the paper down carefully. What do you want? I want you to give me the truth about Evelyn. Who recruited her? How long was she working for you before we married? What instructions were you given by the Hargroves? I want documentation, evidence that proves she was an agent, not a victim, and I want you to testify to that effect at my appeal. Caldwell smiled, an expression without warmth. You are asking me to betray my clients and destroy my reputation in exchange for not releasing evidence that may or may not exist. The evidence exists, and you know I am desperate enough to use it. But here's the part you should care about. If I release that evidence without your cooperation, you lose everything and gain nothing. But if you cooperate, if you help me get a retrial, then the evidence stays buried, your client stays safe, and you walk away clean. There was a long silence. Adrian could hear his own heartbeat, steady and loud in his ears. This was the moment. Either Caldwell would see the logic of the trade, or he would call Adrian's bluff and walk away. And if he walked away, Adrian had nothing left. Caldwell stood, buttoning his jacket. I will consider your offer, but understand something, Blackthorn. Even if I give you what you want, even if you get your retrial, you are not walking out of here innocent. The crimes you committed are real. The people you hurt are real. Exposing the conspiracy behind your conviction does not change that. I am not looking for innocence. I'm looking for leverage. Caldwell paused at the door. That is the difference between you and Evelyn. She actually believes in something beyond herself. That is why she will never help you, no matter how much truth you show her. Because helping you means betraying everything she has built her identity on. And you? What do you believe in? Survival, same as you. He left without another word. Adrian sat in the visiting room for a long time after, staring at the empty chair, feeling the weight of the gamble he had just made. Caldwell was right about one thing. Even if Adrian got his retrial, even if he exposed the conspiracy, he would still be guilty of the crimes that put him here. The fraud, the affairs, the negligence that led to Margaret Collins' death, those were real, undeniable. The only question was whether he could create enough doubt about the trial's integrity to reduce his sentence. But there was something else gnawing at him, something Caldwell had said about Evelyn, that she believed in something beyond herself. That her identity was built on the idea of being a hero, a martyr, a woman who stood up to power and won. And if that identity was threatened, if she was forced to confront the possibility that her triumph had been engineered by others, she would do anything to protect it, even if it meant keeping Adrian buried, which meant that attacking Evelyn's sense of righteousness was the wrong strategy. He needed to give her a way to maintain her identity while still helping him. A path that allowed her to be the hero and the whistleblower at the same time. Adrian spent the next 2 days writing a letter, not to Evelyn directly, but to Margaret Collins' mother, the woman who had testified at his trial, who had spoken with heartbreaking clarity about her daughter's death, who had every reason to hate him. The letter was simple, direct, and completely honest. Mrs. Collins, I am writing to you from prison, where I am serving time for crimes that include contributing to your daughter's death. I do not expect your forgiveness. I do not deserve it. But I need to tell you something that might matter to you. The woman who brought me to justice, Lady Evelyn Blackthorn, was not acting alone. She was part of a conspiracy orchestrated by people who wanted me destroyed for reasons that had nothing to do with your daughter. They used Margaret's death as a weapon, not because they cared about her, but because it was effective. And Evelyn either knew this and participated willingly, or she was manipulated into believing she was serving justice when she was really serving someone else's revenge. I do not know which is true, but you deserve to know that your daughter's memory is being used by people who do not care about her. That her death, which was my fault and my responsibility, has been turned into a tool for settling old business debts and family grievances. If you care about the truth, if you want to know whether the people who claim to speak for Margaret actually honor her memory, then I urge you to ask Evelyn about Richard Caldwell, Lord Ashford, and the Hargrove family. Ask her why she never mentioned them during the trial. Ask her who paid for the investigators, the lawyers, the documentation. Ask her if she was acting as a wife seeking justice or as an agent following orders. He signed it and gave it to Thomas to deliver. It was another gamble, another desperate play. But Mrs. Collins had credibility that Adrian lacked. If she started asking questions, if she demanded answers from Evelyn, it would force a confrontation that Evelyn could not avoid. And confrontations led to cracks. Cracks led to truth. 1 week later, the explosion came. Mrs. Collins went to the newspapers, not with accusations against Evelyn, but with questions. Simple, devastating questions about who had funded the investigation into Adrian's crimes, about why certain evidence had been gathered by private investigators rather than police, about the involvement of Richard Caldwell, a man with known connections to intelligence services and wealthy clients seeking revenge. The newspapers, always hungry for a new angle on an old scandal, seized on the story. Within days, there were editorials demanding transparency, questions in Parliament about whether the trial had been compromised by outside interference, calls for an independent investigation into the evidence used to convict Adrian Blackthorne. And at the center of it all was Evelyn, suddenly on the defensive for the first time since the trial ended. She issued a statement denying any impropriety, claimed that all evidence had been obtained legally, insisted that her uncle's support and Caldwell's assistance were simply the actions of people who cared about justice. But the questions kept coming. Why had she not disclosed these relationships during the trial? Why had the prosecution not investigated the sources of her funding? What exactly was her connection to the Hargrove family, whose name kept appearing in documents related to Caldwell's activities? Adrian watched it unfold from his cell, reading newspapers that arrived days late, piecing together the scandal from fragments. He felt no satisfaction, only the grim awareness that he had set a fire he could not control, and it might consume everyone involved. Thomas visited with news that Caldwell had agreed to testify. Not voluntarily, but because the parliamentary investigation had subpoenaed him, and refusing would have been worse than cooperating. He would confirm that he had been hired by the Hargroves to gather evidence against Adrian, that Lady Evelyn had been recruited to assist in that effort, that her marriage had been part of a long-term operation to infiltrate Adrian's life and document his crimes. It should have been a victory. But Thomas looked sick as he delivered the information. Adrian, you need to understand what this means. If Caldwell testifies, he will destroy Evelyn's reputation. Everything she has built, all the support she gained, the charitable work she has done, it will all be tainted by the revelation that she was an agent. People will call her a liar, a manipulator. They will say she is no better than you. Then she should have told the truth when she had the chance. She was trying to protect people you hurt, trying to make sure your victims got justice. Even if her methods were compromised, her intentions were good. Adrian met his brother's eyes. Intentions do not matter, Thomas. Results matter. And the result is that I was convicted in a trial that was compromised from the beginning. That is not justice. That is revenge dressed up to look like justice. And if Evelyn goes down with me, that is the price of the game she chose to play. Thomas stood abruptly, his face flushed with anger. You have learned nothing. Even now, even after everything, you still think this is just a game. That people are pieces you can move around to win. Evelyn is a human being who was manipulated into serving someone else's agenda, just like the people you manipulated to serve yours. The difference is that she was trying to help victims. You were creating them. Adrian felt the accusation hit home. His brother was right. He had spent his entire life treating people as assets or obstacles, never as equals, never as individuals whose lives mattered beyond their utility to him. And even now, faced with the possibility of freedom, his first instinct was to sacrifice Evelyn to save himself. But survival required ruthlessness, required the willingness to make hard choices without sentiment or regret. That was the lesson Adrian had learned in his years of building an empire, and it was the lesson he was applying now. If Evelyn was collateral damage in his fight for freedom, then so be it. She had made her choice when she decided to destroy him. Now she would live with the consequences. The parliamentary hearing was scheduled for 3 weeks later. Adrian was not allowed to attend, but Thomas provided detailed reports. Caldwell testified for 4 hours, confirming everything Adrian had suspected. The Hargrove family had hired him to orchestrate Adrian's downfall. Lady Evelyn had been recruited through her uncle, Lord Ashford, who had connections to Caldwell through old military intelligence networks. The marriage had been arranged, carefully engineered to place Evelyn in a position to document Adrian's crimes over many years. But Caldwell also testified to something Adrian had not expected. Evelyn had not known the full extent of the operation. She had been told she was helping gather evidence for a legitimate investigation into corruption among the aristocracy. She believed she was serving justice, not personal revenge. It was only later, after years of marriage and documentation, that she had learned the truth about the Hargroves and their motivations, and by then, she was too invested to walk away. The revelation should have exonerated her, proved she was a victim of manipulation, just like Adrian claimed to be. But the public did not see it that way. They saw a woman who had lied about her intentions, who had deceived her husband and the court, who had presented herself as a wronged wife when she was really an agent. The narrative shifted overnight. Evelyn went from hero to villain, her reputation shredded by the same newspapers that had once celebrated her courage. Adrian received a letter from her 3 days after the hearing. It was delivered through official channels, brief and cold. "You have won. I hope you are satisfied. But know this, Margaret Collins is still dead. The families you destroyed are still broken. The crimes you committed are still real. Exposing the conspiracy behind my actions does not change what you did. It just means we are both guilty now." Adrian read the letter in his cell, feeling nothing. No triumph, no regret, just a vast, echoing emptiness where emotions used to be. He had destroyed Evelyn the same way she had destroyed him, not through violence or overt cruelty, but through systematic exposure of truth, through turning her allies against her, through revealing the mechanisms of her power, through forcing her to confront the reality that everything she believed about herself was built on a foundation of lies. And in doing so, he had proven that he had learned nothing, that survival meant repeating the same patterns, the same ruthless calculations, the same willingness to destroy anyone who stood in his way. The retrial was granted 2 months later. The Crown's prosecutor, faced with overwhelming evidence of manipulation and conspiracy, agreed that the original conviction had been compromised. Adrian was released from prison pending the new trial, his assets partially unfrozen to allow him to mount a defense. He walked out of Millbank prison on a cold autumn morning, wearing clothes Thomas had brought, and felt the weight of freedom settle over him like a curse. London had changed in the year he had been locked away, or perhaps he was seeing it clearly for the first time. The streets felt alien, the people moving with purposes he no longer understood. His name was still poison, his reputation still destroyed. The retrial might reduce his sentence, might give him some measure of vindication, but it would not restore what he had lost. And Evelyn had vanished, retreated to some private estate in the countryside, abandoning the charitable work, the public appearances, the carefully constructed identity of the wronged wife seeking justice. The last Thomas had heard, she was living alone, seeing no one, a ghost haunting the ruins of her own making. Adrian stood outside the prison, breathing free air for the first time in a year, and realized that he had won nothing. He had exposed the conspiracy, forced a retrial, destroyed the woman who destroyed him, and in the process, he had confirmed every accusation ever made against him, that he was ruthless, cruel, willing to sacrifice anyone to serve his own interests. The retrial would determine his legal fate, but his actual fate, the kind that mattered, had already been decided. He would never rebuild his empire, never restore his reputation, never be more than the cautionary tale people told about the dangers of unchecked ambition and moral bankruptcy. Thomas was waiting by a carriage, his face carefully neutral. Ready? Adrian looked back at the prison, at the gray walls that had held him, and felt the truth settle into his bones with absolute finality. He had spent his entire life fighting to be free from consequences, to be powerful enough that the rules did not apply to him, and he had succeeded right up until the moment he failed. The question now was whether he could become something different, whether a man who had spent 40 years being a predator could learn to be anything else, whether survival could mean something other than destroying everyone around him. He did not know the answer. But as he climbed into the carriage and felt it roll forward into an uncertain future, Adrian Blackthorne understood for the first time in his life that the person he had been was gone, burned away in the fire he had started. What emerged from those ashes would have to be built from nothing, and this time there would be no shortcuts, no manipulation, no ruthless efficiency, just the slow, painful work of becoming someone who deserved a second chance. If such a thing was even possible. The retrial lasted 6 weeks, and every day felt like walking through broken glass. Adrian sat in the defendant's box in a courthouse that smelled of old wood and stale air, listening to lawyers dissect his life with clinical precision. The conspiracy was real. The manipulation was documented. But beneath all of it, like bedrock under shifting sand, lay the undeniable truth that he had committed every crime he was accused of. The new prosecutor, a younger man named Harrison who lacked the theatrical flair of his predecessor, laid it out simply. Yes, Lady Evelyn was recruited. Yes, there was outside influence on the investigation, but the evidence she gathered was authentic. The affairs happened. The fraud happened. Margaret Collins died because of decisions the defendant made. The conspiracy does not erase his guilt. It only raises questions about the process. And those questions, while troubling, do not change the fundamental facts of what Adrian Blackthorne did to innocent people. Adrian's defense attorney, an expensive hire named Whitmore, argued that the tainted process invalidated the conviction, that a trial built on manipulation could not stand, regardless of the defendant's actual guilt. It was a technical argument, bloodless and procedural, and Adrian could see the jury struggling with it. They wanted simple answers: guilty or innocent, hero or villain. The complexity of a conspiracy that was both real and irrelevant seemed to frustrate them. The verdict came on a gray November afternoon. Guilty on the fraud charges. Guilty on criminal negligence in Margaret Collins' death. But the sentence was reduced to time served plus 3 years of supervised release, with the caveat that any violation would result in immediate return to prison. Adrian stood as the judge delivered the ruling, feeling nothing. Not relief, not disappointment, just the dull acknowledgement that this chapter was closing without any real resolution. He was free, technically, but bound by restrictions that would define his life for years. He could not leave England, could not engage in business without oversight, could not reclaim his title or his estate. He walked out of the courthouse into cold rain, wearing a coat Thomas had brought, and found a crowd waiting. Not supporters, protesters. People holding signs with Margaret Collins' face, with slogans about justice betrayed and the aristocracy protecting its own. They shouted at him as he walked to the carriage, their voices blending into a wall of noise that felt more like weather than communication. One woman broke through the police line and got close enough to spit at his feet. "You do not deserve to walk free. You do not deserve to breathe the same air as the people you destroyed." Adrian met her eyes and saw something familiar there. Not hatred exactly, grief wearing the mask of anger. He wondered who she had lost, what connection she had to his crimes. But there was no point asking, no words that would change anything. Thomas was waiting in the carriage, looking older than his years. They rode in silence through streets Adrian barely recognized. London had moved on without him. New buildings under construction, different faces in the crowds. The world was indifferent to his return, which was somehow worse than hostility. "I have secured a small residence for you in Southwark. Nothing grand, but private. You can live quietly there during your supervised release." Adrian nodded. "And after? When the 3 years are done?" Thomas hesitated. "Then you will have to decide what kind of man you want to be. Because the man you were before is dead. Everyone knows it. The question is whether you can build something new from what is left." The house in Southwark was a narrow townhouse on a street lined with similar structures, all of them modest and anonymous. 3 floors, sparsely furnished, with windows that looked out onto a courtyard shared by neighboring buildings. It was the kind of place Adrian would have walked past without noticing in his former life. Now it was everything he had. He spent the first week simply existing, waking up, eating meals Thomas arranged to be delivered, sitting by the window and watching people go about their lives with the kind of purpose he no longer possessed. He had always defined himself by what he was building, what he was conquering, what he was taking. Without those things, he did not know who he was. The supervised release required weekly meetings with a magistrate named Collins. No relation to Margaret, but enough of a coincidence to feel intentional. Collins was in his 60s, gray-haired and stern, with the manner of someone who had seen every variation of human failure and was impressed by none of it. "You will find employment within 60 days. Something legitimate. And you will provide weekly reports on your activities, your associations, your finances. Any deviation from these requirements will be considered a violation." "What kind of employment do you imagine I can find? I am a disgraced duke. No one will hire me." "Then you will learn to do work that does not require a title. Manual labor, clerking, whatever you can find that earns an honest living. That is the point of this sentence, Blackthorne, to force you to understand what it means to survive without power or privilege." Adrian left the meeting feeling the weight of what had been said. For the first time in his life, he would have to work for someone else, take orders, accept supervision, live within means he could not manipulate or expand through cleverness or ruthlessness. It should have been humiliating, but instead he felt something unexpected. Relief. The search for work took longer than 60 days. Most employers rejected him immediately once they learned his name. Those who did not reject him outright offered positions so degrading they seemed designed to punish rather than employ. But eventually, he found something. A small accounting firm run by a man named Fletcher who needed someone to organize old files and ledgers that had been neglected for years. The work is boring and the pay is minimal, but if you can handle it without stealing or causing problems, you can stay. Adrian took the job. The office was cramped and dusty, filled with boxes of documents dating back decades. His task was to sort them, create an indexing system, make the chaos manageable. It was the kind of work he would have assigned to servants in his old life. Now he did it himself, his hands stained with ink and dust, his back aching from hours bent over boxes. But there was something meditative about it, the simple act of bringing order to disorder, of taking something broken and making it functional. He found himself working late into the evenings, not because Fletcher demanded it, but because the work gave him something his old life never had. A sense of completion that did not require destroying anyone. 3 months into his supervised release, Adrian received a letter. It arrived at the Southwark house on a Tuesday morning, delivered by regular post, the handwriting familiar, even though he had not seen it in over a year. Evelyn. He opened it standing by the window, the paper heavy and expensive, the kind she had always preferred. Adrian. I am writing to you because there are things that need to be said, and I lack the courage to say them in person. You were right about the conspiracy. I was used, manipulated into believing I was serving justice when I was really serving revenge. That does not excuse what you did. The crimes were real, the victims were real, but it means that my triumph was hollow, built on lies the same way your empire was. We are both guilty, both complicit in systems that use people and discard them. I destroyed you because I thought it would make me feel whole, but it did not. It just made me realize that revenge is not justice. It is just more destruction wearing a different mask. I do not expect forgiveness. I do not deserve it. But I want you to know that I am sorry. Not for exposing your crimes, but for believing that doing so made me better than you. We were both players in a game neither of us truly understood, and now we are both living with the consequences. I hope you find something worth building in whatever time you have left. Something that does not require destroying others to succeed. Because I am trying to do the same, and it is harder than anything I have ever done. There was no signature, just her initials at the bottom. EA, not Blackthorn anymore. She had reclaimed her maiden name after the scandal, a small act of separation that seemed appropriate. Adrian read the letter 3 times, then folded it carefully and placed it in a drawer. He did not respond. There were no words that would bridge the distance between them. They had each ruined the other in ways that could not be repaired. The best they could hope for was parallel lives, far enough apart that they did not inflict further damage. But the letter changed something in him, made him realize that Evelyn was facing the same emptiness he was, the same question of what to build from ruins. And if she could find the courage to try, to attempt something new without the framework of revenge or righteousness to guide her, then perhaps he could too. He began spending his evenings differently. Instead of sitting alone in the townhouse, he started walking through Southwark, observing the neighborhood, the people. This part of London was not aristocratic. It was working class, filled with families who survived through labor and cooperation rather than wealth and manipulation. He watched them help each other, share resources, build communities that functioned through trust rather than power. One evening, he found himself outside a small schoolhouse where children from the neighborhood gathered for lessons. The building was run down, the windows cracked, the roof leaking. A woman stood outside trying to repair the door hinge with inadequate tools. She looked up as Adrian approached. "Can I help you?" "I was watching you struggle with that hinge. I think you need a different screwdriver." She laughed, tired but not unkind. "I need a lot of things. But yes, a better screwdriver would be a start." Adrian went to a nearby shop, purchased proper tools, and returned. He spent an hour helping her fix the door, then the window frames that were rotting. The woman, whose name was Sarah, explained that she ran the school with donations from local families, trying to provide basic education to children whose parents could not afford tutors. "We do what we can with what we have, but it is never quite enough." Adrian looked at the building, seeing a dozen problems that needed solving. Things he could fix if he had resources. But he did not have resources anymore. Just his hands and whatever knowledge remained from a lifetime of building empires. Perhaps that was enough. He started coming back regularly, repairing things, organizing the school's meager supplies, teaching the older children basic mathematics and accounting, skills they would need to survive in a world that did not care about their potential. Sarah was suspicious at first, unable to understand why a man with Adrian's background would volunteer in a place like this. What do you get out of it? Adrian considered the question. Something to do. Something that does not involve destroying people. She accepted that answer, though he could tell she did not entirely trust him. Trust had to be earned, and he had a lifetime of distrust to overcome. The work at Fletcher's accounting firm continued. Adrian proved competent enough that Fletcher started giving him more responsibility. Actual bookkeeping rather than just organizing files. Client meetings where Adrian had to sit quietly and take notes while Fletcher conducted business. It was humbling in ways that prison never was. In prison, he could maintain the fiction that he was above his circumstances. Here, in the daily grind of ordinary work, there was no fiction to maintain. He was exactly what he appeared to be. A man trying to survive without the advantages he had once taken for granted. One afternoon, Fletcher called him into the office. "I know who you are, Blackthorne. Known from the beginning. But you show up on time, you do the work, and you do not cause trouble. That is more than I can say for half the men I have hired over the years. So I am offering you a permanent position. Same pay, but steadier, if you want it." Adrian felt something crack in his chest. The simple act of being valued for showing up and doing work. For meeting the lowest possible standard of reliability. It should not have mattered. But it did. "I want it." Fletcher nodded. "Good. Now get back to those ledgers. The Morrison account is a mess, and I need it sorted by Friday." Adrian returned to his desk, sat down, and stared at the columns of numbers waiting to be balanced. This was his life now. Small tasks, modest goals, the kind of existence he would have scorned a few years ago. But sitting there surrounded by dusty files and the quiet hum of the office, he felt something he had not experienced in years. Peace. 6 months into his supervised release, Adrian received word that Lord Ashford had died. Heart failure, sudden and unexpected. The funeral was private, limited to close family. Adrian was not invited, but Thomas attended and reported back. Evelyn was there. She looked diminished, like someone going through motions without feeling. Lord Ashford's death seemed to break something in her. He was the last connection she had to the conspiracy, to the people who used her. Now she is completely alone. Adrian felt an unexpected surge of sympathy. Whatever crimes they had committed against each other, they were both orphans of the same war now. Both cast out from the worlds they had known, forced to build new identities from fragments. He wrote a letter to Evelyn, simple and direct. "I heard about your uncle. I am sorry for your loss. Not because I liked him, but because I know what it feels like to lose the last connection to who you used to be. If you need anything, if there is some way I can help that does not make things worse, you know where to find me." He sent it without expecting a response. But 2 weeks later, a letter arrived. "Adrian, thank you for your words. They meant more than you know. I have been thinking about what comes next. What kind of life is possible after everything we have done to each other? I do not have answers, but I'm trying to learn how to live without needing them. There is a small cottage in Devonshire that belonged to my mother. I am moving there. Away from London, away from society, away from everything that reminds me of who I was. I am going to try to be someone else. Someone simpler. I do not know if it is possible to change at our age, but I have to try. I hope you find your own version of that, whatever it looks like." Adrian folded the letter and placed it with the first one. 2 communications across an unbridgeable distance. Not reconciliation exactly, just acknowledgement that they were both surviving the aftermath of their mutual destruction. The schoolhouse in Southwark became Adrian's primary focus outside of work. He spent evenings and weekends repairing the building, teaching classes, helping Sarah manage the administrative chaos of running a charity on no budget. The children were wary of him at first, sensing something broken in this man who spoke with an educated accent but dressed like a laborer. But children were more forgiving than adults. Once they realized he would show up consistently, that he would answer their questions and treat them with patience, they began to trust him. One boy, maybe 10 years old, asked him a question that cut straight through the careful walls Adrian had built. "Why do you help us? You are not from here. You do not have to be here." Adrian stopped what he was doing, a hammer frozen mid-swing. The honest answer was too complicated. "Because I destroyed people, and this is the only way I know to build something instead. Because I need to prove to myself that I am capable of creating without destroying. Because every hour I spend here is an hour where I am not the person I used to be." But he could not say any of that to a child. So he settled for a simpler truth. Because everyone deserves a chance to learn. And because fixing things is easier than breaking them once you figure out how. The boy seemed satisfied with that answer, which was more than Adrian could say for himself. 1 year into his supervised release, Adrian attended a mandatory meeting with Magistrate Collins. The routine had become familiar. Report on employment, activities, associations. Confirm that he was complying with the terms of his sentence. But this time, Collins had something different to say. "I have been reviewing your file, Blackthorne. You have met every requirement, maintained steady employment, stayed out of trouble, even engaged in community service, which was not required. I am authorized to recommend early termination of your supervised release if I believe you have demonstrated genuine rehabilitation." Adrian felt his pulse quicken. Early termination meant freedom, real freedom, the ability to leave England, to start over somewhere else, to escape the constant surveillance and restrictions. But Collins was not finished. "The question I have to ask myself is whether you have actually changed, or whether you are just competent at following rules. Because I have seen plenty of men in your position who do everything right until the moment the supervision ends. Then they go right back to being who they were before. So I'm going to ask you directly. Who are you, Adrian Blackthorne? Are you the man who destroyed families for profit, or are you something else now?" Adrian sat in silence for a long moment, feeling the weight of the question. A year ago, he would have lied without hesitation. Would have said whatever Collins wanted to hear to secure his freedom. But something had shifted in the months of quiet work, of fixing things instead of breaking them, of teaching children who had no reason to trust him. "I do not know who I am, but I know who I do not want to be anymore. I spent my life believing that power was the only thing that mattered, that people were resources to be used or obstacles to be removed, and it destroyed me. Not Evelyn, not the conspiracy. Me. I built my entire identity on a foundation that could not hold, and when it collapsed, there was nothing left. So now I'm trying to build something different, something small, maybe something that matters. I do not know if it is enough, but it is all I have." Collins studied him with those sharp, assessing eyes. Then he stamped a document and slid it across the desk. "Early termination approved. Effective immediately. You are free to go wherever you want, do whatever you want within the bounds of the law. Do not make me regret this decision." Adrian walked out of the magistrate's office into cold winter sunlight, officially free for the first time in 2 years. He should have felt triumphant, but instead he felt the weight of choice settling over him like snow. He could leave England now, start over in America or the continent, rebuild under a different name, reclaim some version of the power he had lost. Or he could stay. Continue the work at Fletcher's firm, keep teaching at the schoolhouse, build a life that would never be grand or impressive, but might actually mean something beyond his own survival. He walked through London for hours, watching the city move around him with its usual indifference. By the time he returned to Southwark, he had made his decision. He stayed. Another year passed. Then another. The rhythm of Adrian's life became so ordinary that he sometimes forgot he had ever been anything else. Work at Fletcher's firm, which eventually became Fletcher and Blackthorne when the old man decided to make him a partner. Teaching at the schoolhouse, which expanded into a proper institution with funding from local businesses. Quiet evenings in the townhouse, reading or walking through the neighborhood that had become his home. Thomas visited regularly, always slightly baffled by his brother's transformation, but no longer questioning it. You could have more, you know. There are opportunities, investments you could make, connections you could rebuild. You do not have to live like this. Adrian looked around the modest townhouse, at the simple furniture and well-worn books. Like what? Like a man who has finally stopped running from himself? Thomas smiled, sad but genuine. "I suppose that is exactly what I mean." Evelyn wrote occasionally from Devonshire. Brief letters describing her life in the cottage, the garden she was learning to tend, the local families she had started helping with small acts of charity. She never mentioned London or the past, just the present, unfolding one day at a time. Adrian responded with equal brevity. Descriptions of the schoolhouse, problems he was solving at the firm, observations about the neighborhood. They were not friends exactly. The distance between them was still too vast, too stained with blood. But they were witnesses to each other's transformations, proof that change, however difficult and incomplete, was possible. On the 5th anniversary of his release from prison, Adrian received an unexpected visitor at the schoolhouse. A woman in her 40s, plainly dressed, with a face worn by grief but not broken by it. "Mr. Blackthorne? I am Grace Collins, Margaret's mother." Adrian felt his heart stop. He stood slowly, acutely aware of the children watching from their desks, sensing the tension without understanding it. "Mrs. Collins." She stepped closer, her eyes searching his face. "I came to see if the rumors were true, that you are here, working with children, teaching them, after what you did to my daughter." Adrian forced himself to meet her gaze. "They are true. I do not expect you to understand or approve. I know nothing I do will bring Margaret back. But this is the only way I know to try to be something other than the man who killed her." Grace Collins stood in silence, her hands clenched at her sides. Then, slowly, she began to speak. "My daughter died because you were careless with her life, because you saw her as something disposable. And for years I hated you with everything I had. I wanted you to suffer, wanted you destroyed. When Lady Evelyn brought you down, I thought I would feel justice. But I just felt empty, because Margaret was still gone, and revenge did not bring her back. It just created more pain." She paused, taking a shaky breath. "I do not forgive you. I cannot. But I came here today because I needed to see if you had changed, if you had learned anything from what happened. And I can see that you're trying, that you're teaching these children with patience and care, that you show up day after day, doing work that will never erase your crimes but might prevent someone else from repeating them. That is not redemption, but it is something. And maybe something is all we get in this life." Adrian felt tears burning in his eyes but did not let them fall. "Thank you for telling me. I will keep trying, for whatever it is worth." She nodded once, then turned to leave. At the door she paused. "Margaret wanted to be a teacher. Did you know that?" "No. I did not know her well enough to know anything about her dreams. She wanted to teach children to read, to give them opportunities she never had. So when I see you here, doing this work, I think about what she might have become if she had lived, and it makes me angry and sad and grateful all at once, because at least someone is doing what she wanted to do, even if it should have been her." She left without another word. Adrian stood in the silent schoolhouse, surrounded by children who were watching him with wide, questioning eyes, and felt the full weight of what it meant to live with irreversible consequences. Grace Collins had given him something he did not deserve, not forgiveness, but acknowledgment that his efforts, however inadequate, were not meaningless. That evening, Adrian wrote to Evelyn, "Something happened today that I need to tell you about. Margaret's mother came to see me. She said she cannot forgive me, but she acknowledged that I am trying to be different. It was the hardest conversation I have ever had, and I do not think I handled it well. But it made me realize that redemption is not something we achieve. It is something we pursue forever, knowing we will never fully reach it. I think you understand that better than anyone. We cannot undo what we did, cannot restore what we destroyed, but we can spend whatever time we have left trying to build instead of break. And maybe that is enough. Not for the people we hurt, but for ourselves. So that when we reach the end, we can say we tried to be better than we were. I hope your garden is growing well. I hope you have found peace in that quiet place. And I hope you know that what you wrote to me years ago about trying to be someone simpler has stayed with me every day since. We are both still trying. And as long as we keep trying, there is hope." Her response came 2 weeks later. "Adrian, Margaret's mother showed courage by confronting you, and you showed courage by not looking away. That is more than most people ever manage. I think about redemption often, about whether it is possible for people like us. I do not have answers, but I know that every morning I wake up in this cottage and tend to this garden, I am choosing to be someone different than I was. And every evening I go to sleep knowing I did not harm anyone today. That is a small victory, but it is mine. Keep building, Adrian. Keep teaching those children. Keep showing up. It will not erase the past, but it will create a future that is separate from it, and that is all any of us can hope for. Adrian folded the letter and placed it with all the others, an archive of two people learning to live with themselves. Not forgiveness, not reconciliation, just the slow, painful process of becoming people who could look in mirrors without flinching. 10 years after his release from prison, Adrian Blackthorne stood in front of the schoolhouse on a bright spring morning and watched children file through doors he had repaired, into classrooms he had helped build, to learn from teachers he had helped train. The building was no longer run down. It was a functioning institution, supported by the community, making a real difference in lives that would have been forgotten otherwise. Fletcher had retired the previous year, leaving the accounting firm entirely in Adrian's hands. It was modest but profitable, serving small businesses and working families rather than aristocrats and speculators, the kind of enterprise that would never make anyone rich but help people survive. Thomas visited less frequently now. His own family and responsibilities kept him occupied. But when they did meet, Adrian saw something in his brother's eyes that had not been there before. Respect. Not for the man Adrian had been, but for the man he had become. On quiet evenings, Adrian still thought about his old life, the power, the wealth, the empire he had built and lost. But those thoughts felt distant now, like memories of someone else's life. He had been that man once, had believed that domination was the same as success, had destroyed people because he could, because it was efficient, because it served his interests. That man was dead, burned away in prison and rebuilt through a decade of small, unglamorous work that would never be written about in newspapers or celebrated in society. And Adrian had learned something in that rebuilding that he could never have understood in his old life. Power was not strength. Strength was showing up every day to do work that mattered to people who would never thank you. Strength was facing the consequences of your actions without excuse or deflection. Strength was living with irreversible mistakes and still choosing to build something good from whatever remained. He would never be redeemed, never be forgiven by everyone he had hurt, never undo the damage he had caused. But he could be present, could be useful, could be someone the children in that schoolhouse trusted to show up and care about their futures. That was not triumph, but it was enough. Late that night, Adrian sat at his desk and wrote one final letter to Evelyn. We have been corresponding for a decade now. Two people learning to live with themselves. I think we have done well, considering where we started. You in your garden in Devonshire, me in this townhouse in Southwark, both of us building lives that will never be grand but might actually mean something. I do not know if we will ever meet again. Part of me thinks it is better if we do not. We are reminders of each other's worst selves, and maybe that distance is necessary for us to continue growing. But I want you to know that your letters have been a lifeline. Proof that change is possible even for people like us. Proof that we can become something other than what we were. Thank you for that. And thank you for destroying me when I needed to be destroyed. It was the greatest act of mercy anyone ever showed me, even though it was meant as revenge. I hope your garden continues to grow. I hope you have found peace. And I hope that when you look back on your life, you see more than just what you did to me, because you are more than that. We both are. We are the people we became after everything burned down, and those people are worth something. He sealed the letter and left it on the desk to be mailed in the morning. Then he stood at the window, looking out at the quiet street, at the ordinary houses filled with ordinary lives, and felt something he had not experienced in his youth. Contentment. Not happiness exactly. The weight of his crimes was too heavy for that. But contentment, the sense that he was where he needed to be, doing what he needed to do, living a life that aligned with the person he was trying to become. Adrian Blackthorne would never be remembered as a great man. His name would remain tainted for generations. But in this small corner of London, in this modest schoolhouse and accounting firm, he was building something that would outlast him. Children who learned to read, families who kept their finances stable, a community that functioned a little better because he showed up every day and did the work. That was his legacy now. Not empire, not power, just the quiet accumulation of small acts that helped people survive. And as he stood there in the darkness, feeling the weight of years and choices pressing down on him, Adrian Blackthorne understood the final truth that had eluded him his entire life. The strongest thing a man could do was not conquer. It was not dominate. It was not accumulate power until the world bent to his will. The strongest thing that a man could do was admit he was wrong, face the ruins of what he had destroyed, and spend whatever time remained building something that did not require anyone else's suffering to exist. That was the only victory that mattered, the only triumph worth pursuing. And after decades of chasing the wrong things, Adrian Blackthorne had finally found it.